Shantae and the Pirate's Curse marks what would be the final game in the series to be developed first and foremost for a Nintendo handheld system, being initially released for the 3DS on October 23rd, 2014. However, for the first time in Shantae history, a home console version was also being worked on and announced prior to the game's launch, with a Wii U port following just 2 months after the 3DS version. As has been the case with the first 2 games in the series, WayForward seems to have ensured that they possessed extensive knowledge of a console's workings before making the commitment to bringing their signature franchise to that platform, with Pirate's Curse being the company's 11th 3DS game. While the majority of these titles are unremarkable licensed works, they did ensure that Shantae's development team would understand all the nuances of what made the 3DS tick, enabling them to apply their winning formula to the console, leading to another finely crafted entry in the series. In episode 3 of this retrospective, I will be examining the changes that Pirate's Curse implemented, 2 of which having particular significance, and what impact they had on the game when compared to its predecessors. I will also discuss the game's inclusion of greater character development and a more detailed narrative, as well as how the rise of the indie platformer may have affected some of Shantae's gameplay elements. All footage of the game that you will see in this video was taken from the PC version, unlike the director's cut of Risky's Revenge. With its small but substantial change to that game's warp system, there are no meaningful difference between the numerous ports of Pirate's Curse. The original Shantae and Risky's Revenge are 2 games that were very much cast in the same mould. Revenge definitely administered some much needed refinements, but it wasn't too concerned with expanding upon the original, as much as it was simply introducing the Shantae concept to a wider audience. Pirate's Curse, on the other hand, brings with it 2 major alterations, at least on the surface, in the removal of both Shantae's ability to transform and the single traversable overworld. The eradication of transformations was necessitated by the ending of Risky's Revenge, which saw Shantae forcefully abnegated of her powers, with her genie half being separated from herself and subsequently destroyed. Taking their place is Risky's pirate gear, bringing with them a range of new abilities, although they essentially serve the same purpose of expanding Shantae's explorative abilities, in addition to granting the player with more options when in combat. The pirate gear ranges from a pistol that can shoot switches from a distance to Risky's boots, which plagiarises the speed booster from Metroid and allows you to sprint at ludicrous speed, smashing through destructible terrain and enemies alike. What I found to be the most versatile and engaging of these items is the pirate hat, which can be deployed mid-jump in order to float over a long distance. Not only does this greatly extend the range of your jumps horizontally, but in certain areas denoted by the gathering leaves, you can also ascend upwards. The benefits of this tricorn come parachutes inclusion is twofold. Firstly, it allows for the implementation of challenges and hazards previously not possible, as none of the transformations abilities really permitted Shantae to interact with her surroundings in quite this way. The hazards relating to verticality I thought were particularly well conceived, with the player perpetually riding a gust of wind upwards, meaning you can only move across the x-axis in order to evade the oncoming spiked obstacles. While the hat may be the only tool which doesn't have the capacity to inflict direct damage to an enemy, it does facilitate quite the opposite, and is a great means by which to elude skirmishers. As Shantae and the Pirate's Curse will once again have you making your way through some locales on multiple occasions, having an easy means to re-navigate those areas without the burden of fending off the same foes makes those sections feel far less repetitious. I would also like to bring particular attention to the scimitar, which allows Shantae to perform a down thrust that can either demolish specific blocks directly below her, or pogo off of enemies in a Scrooge McDuck-like fashion. I make that comparison very specifically, as I suspect that this item's incorporation into Shantae's repertoire was principally so that WayForward could repurpose their own work from Ducktales Remastered. Not that there's anything wrong with their doing so, it just doesn't seem coincidental that Shantae would gain this skill in particular a year after Ducktales' re-emergence into the video game market. While the removal of Shantae's transformations may be a disappointment to some, being a core aspect of the series' identity, I think that it is a carefully considered measure that works out for the best, especially in the context of the narrative. The game very lightly explores the theme of identity, with Shantae not always being so sure of what her place in the world is anymore now that she is no longer a half-genie. Not being able to transform reinforces this, and gives the player a more tangible notion of what effect this would have on her day-to-day life. It is through Shantae's dogged determination and resourcefulness in her usage of these new tools that allows her to overcome the odds, thus demonstrating that she can still fulfill her role as Scuttletown's guardian, regardless of her innate abilities or race. As for the overworld changes, Pirate's Curse opts to have the player explore a collection of islands, with each one housing its own objectives, sub-story, and dungeon. The move away from a single expansive overworld is easily the most contentious aspect of the game. Unlike the replacement of transformations with pirate tools, this change does have a material impact on how the game is played, but it's also a completely subjective one that as many people may prefer to those who despise it. The islands consist of vastly differing environments, but all of which should be familiar to fans of the series. The desert is here of course, in its third consecutive appearance, alongside zombie-infested woodlands and snow-covered mountains, making their return after being omitted from Risky's Revenge. The layout of the islands follows the design philosophy seen in Revenge, by which I mean their design feels quite artificial and more like a traditional 2D platformer style level, rather than the exploratory Metroidvania-esque world from the first game, with its hideaways and environmental obstructions. That isn't to say the layout of these islands is poor in any way, they instead make for what I found to be the most enjoyable non-dungeon areas seen in the series thus far. Their compact design, coupled with the better manoeuvrability options the pirate tools provide, mean that they can be sailed through, and that most of the objectives in these areas will never take more than a few minutes to complete. The most significant way in which this change affects gameplay relates to exploration. I mentioned in my previous video how Risky's Revenge didn't let you venture too far ahead without redirecting you back on track in some way. Pirate's Curse takes this even further by locking each island until you have acquired the map for it, which you'll only receive after completing the previous island's dungeon. This doesn't mean that exploring has been completely removed, as each island hosts a number of hidden collectibles, and there'll be times when returning to a previously visited island is required in order to progress further in another one. The two collectibles this time around are Heart Squids, 4 of which upgrades your maximum health, and Cacklebats, with all 20 of these mutated Tinkerbats needing to be located in order to experience the true final boss and ending. The placement of these ranges from perfunctory to overly obtuse. I think with the Heart Squids, the developers wanted to be sure that everyone would at least be able to gain a few additional hearts, regardless of how much effort into locating them they put in, leading to some being placed in completely unmissable locations. However, gathering all the Cacklebats will require combing over the islands and dungeons in great detail, and in some cases slamming yourself into seemingly irrelevant walls. Although I personally would have preferred that the overworld wasn't displaced, I can't criticise WayForward for trialling a new approach to their world design, as sometimes prodigious reforms like these are essential in the prevention of staleness from creeping in. You will never truly know how well a new concept will work unless you fully commit to its implementation, and while it may not have worked for me in this instance, its impact on my overall enjoyment of the game was only slight, amounting to a feeling of disappointment rather than content. Of course, there are a number of other changes, just none so impactful. For instance, dungeons have a map now. These are automatically filled in as you explore, but a complete map can also be found in a chest that will display areas that you haven't yet uncovered. This is a welcome feature to be sure, although sometimes the map doesn't effectively convey which room will lead to where in some of the more fragmented labyrinths, most notably the Oubliette of Suffering. Also, they could have employed a colour scheme that wasn't directly lifted from Castlevania, even down to having the same red square rooms representing save points. Items have reverted to being consumables, doing away with the MP style bar. Although at first glance I didn't like this change, as I preferred how the system in Revenge encouraged item usage, rather than hoarding, but Pirate's Curse does improve upon the original on this front. Enemies will now drop items when defeated, and with enough frequency that I never found myself needing to purchase spike balls or bubble shields from the shop. This meant that I could use my gems on upgrading my standard hair whip, increasing not only its speed this time, but also its damage, as indicated by the number that appears when striking an enemy. In the last episode, I briefly analysed an early screenshot of Risky's Revenge, which featured these action RPG-esque damage numbers, and although they were dropped for that game, they found their way here into Pirate's Curse. These damage numbers give additional feedback to the player, letting them know that an attack has been successful, complementing the animation of the enemy sprites that occur when they have been struck. The damage Shantae takes is likewise displayed when taking a hit, allowing the game to better indicate the increased ferocity and danger of foes as the journey progresses. With the higher damage output of late game minions and bosses, it gives a better sense of the mounting struggle that our heroine is having to endure. Speaking of enemies, what I do like is how their attacks and actions are consistent across games. The mermaids, spiders and archers all possess the same attacks and movement patterns as before, meaning that even on my first time encountering them, I know what to expect from them and how to best go about vanquishing them. This consistency I find to also be important in immersion. When playing through a game series that has you repeatedly coming back to the same world, you expect that world to abide by the rules that previous entries have already laid out. So when confronted with hostiles that appear in multiple games, having them perform the same attacks is one way to help you effortlessly slip back into the world. Of course, it's not as important as having characters and locations whose traits and designs remain persistent, but when you become familiar with a fictitious world such as Sequinland, it's surprisingly easy for a seemingly insignificant inconsistency to break that all-important sense of immersion. Like with the returning locations, certain monsters who were absent in Risky's Revenge are present once again, and even in the 12-year gap between their debut and return, they too are consistent with their movement and actions. Pirate's Curse also experiments with some entirely new gameplay elements in order to keep the action fresh. The seemingly endless Roddy-Tops carrying segment strips the player down to the two fundamental actions of a platformer, running and jumping. While this portion of the game does overstay its welcome somewhat, it makes a good teaching tool for players in the importance of learning enemy actions and how combat can be shirked. There is also a stealth-oriented act, where you are once again highly limited in your capabilities, and must sneak past a series of guards, either by moving when they inexplicably turn to stare at a blank wall, or by hiding in the shadows. This isn't the first time that the series has added a sprinkling of other genres into the mix. Risky's Revenge featured a 2D shooter zone, and while Thunder Force 4 this certainly was not, moments like these serve as a nice palate cleanser from the regularly scheduled action. The transition from an interconnected world to environmentally diverse archipelago also renders the need for a warp system moot. Risky's ship can be found docked at the beginning of each islet, and from there you can travel to any other landmass that you have already unlocked. A pirate flare item has been introduced that when used will instantly transport Shantae back to the vessel. So while there are some occasions where travelling to a previous island to find a single item is necessary for story progression, it never takes all that long, especially as you get further into the game and can charge at breakneck speed through most screens. As for the labyrinth's composition, there isn't much to discuss beyond what I've already said in the previous videos. They very much follow the same formula of fighting monsters, solving puzzles, and finding the tool required in order to access the boss fight. WayForward have gotten their dungeon design down to an exact science by this point. I never find any of them to be boring or suffering from any major design flaws. They always incorporate puzzles or obstacles that necessitate the usage of your newly acquired tool, and succeed in teaching the player about how said tool is used before adding an element of danger, so that the players can apply what they've learned. The bosses do mostly lapse back to the original Shantae's design tendencies, whereby the usage of a dungeon's corresponding pirate tool is mandatory in order to overcome the boss. Risky's Revenge did away with this and allowed the player to choose how they wish to tackle any boss, but this reversion does make sense in the case of Pirate's Curse. With the items being more complex in their usage, and with nearly all of them having some sort of combat functionality, having the bosses require that the items are utilised ensures that the player fully understands its mechanics. A good example of this is the steel maggot fight at the abandoned factory. This dungeon granted access to the cannon, which allows Shantae to perform 3 additional jumps while in the air. The boss can only be damaged by activating the 3 switches on its back, which is done by performing a cannon jump while directly above these switches. This teaches the player that not only does the firing of a cannon propel Shantae vertically, the cannonball it shoots isn't just for show and has practical applications. It's becoming more and more needless to highlight the presentation of Shantae games as the series goes on. The game looks and sounds great, why should you expect anything less by this point? Having said that, there are still a few points of interest that I noted during my playthrough. This is the first instance of a Shantae game having high definition backgrounds, which are used in all versions of the game with the exception of the 3DS. Risky's Revenge Director's Cut, which was released on PC just 8 days prior to Pirate's Curse, still used the same backgrounds as the DSi version, just with the option to alter the game's resolution. As Pirate's Curse was due to be released on home consoles from the outset, WayForward wisely opted to create HD versions of all the backgrounds for the game. However, as it was only the backgrounds that have seen this upgrade, all the sprites retain their pixel art aesthetic. This leads to something of a styles clash between the sprite-based action in the foreground and the smooth high-definition artwork serving as the backdrop, which some people may not prefer. I personally don't have a preference on this, and would always choose to play the PC or home console version of the game to take advantage of a bigger screen and a wider choice of controllers. Pirate's Curse does reuse some assets from Risky's Revenge. Most noticeably, the Shantae sprite has been pretty much copied and pasted. The game's code even contains unused sprites, such as Shantae swimming and jumping between layers that were used in Revenge. This does hint that maybe both of those features were intended at some point, but it's more likely that they're just leftovers from when all of the data was migrated over. While this may seem like laziness on the part of WayForward, the argument of if it ain't broke, don't fix it can also be applied. The Shantae sprite from Revenge is still just as perfect for this game, so why go through all the effort of redesigning assets when you already have a trove of perfectly usable ones? There are of course a plenitude of new animations that occur for when the pirate tools are used, so it's not like the animation department were able to coast their way through the project atop of their previous work. In a first for the series, Shantae and the Pirate's Curse features voice acting, with Christina V voicing both Shantae and Risky. The vast majority of the game's dialogue doesn't feature any sort of narration, but at the start of select cutscenes, Shantae will speak a word or two, usually just stating a character's name. The inflection of the voice does establish the tone of the conversation to come, and many games that can't stretch their budget for a fully voiced story will often utilise this method to bring a bit of extra life to their characters. Voice samples are also played during certain moments of gameplay, such as taking a hit, adding weight to those actions and giving further life to the Shantae character through auditory means. Thus far, of all the adjectives that could be applied to the Shantae games, difficult would certainly not be one. While nobody is going to accuse Pirate's Curse of being an overly challenging game, it does greatly up its demands of the player in certain segments, most notably the last stretch preceding the final boss. This area features by far the highest concentration of instant death hazards such as spikes and bottomless pits. While actually getting a game over isn't likely to happen, as you can always just use a potion, some of these screens took me far more attempts than any other challenge I've yet encountered in the series. These platforming sections that demand near perfect precision feel decidedly un-Shantae-like, but if looked at in the context of 2D platformers at the time, were very much the order of the day. During the early and mid-2000s, 2D platformers were considered old hat by the larger developers. With the ability to create immersive 3D worlds, 2D gaming seemed like something of a relic, or was only to be found on the weaker handheld platforms. Later in the decade though, traditional platformers underwent quite the revival, with small independents, sometimes lone developers, carving out a niche for themselves by creating games inspired by the 8 and 16-bit aesthetic seen 15 to 20 years prior. It wasn't just the graphical style and music that these games borrowed from, but also their brutal difficulty. Many games from this time period prided themselves on the challenge they presented, standing defiant of the overall trend seen in gaming towards more cinematic games that favoured graphical presentation and film-like storytelling, whilst toning down on the difficulty. Titles like I Wanna Be the Guy and Super Meat Boy achieved great popularity / notoriety, partly due to them being very cheap to purchase or even free, but also because they offered a kind of masochistic challenge that couldn't be found within mainstream AAA games. Works like these paved the way for a 2D platformer boom period, and it wasn't too long before the market became oversaturated with games of this ilk. Even bigger companies were taking note, such as Capcom, who threw their hat into the ring with Mega Man's 9 and 10. Lesser developers resorted to including terms like 8-bit or retro in their title, in the hopes that people would find them in the boundless ocean of other games that hopped onto the bandwagon. While the Shantae series obviously predates this renaissance, its design seems to have gotten somewhat caught up in the wave of NES hard mania that was running rampant during its development period. So while some of the platforming sections in Pirate's Curse may seem out of character for the series, I'm sure some of the WayForward developers had seen and played many of these games and took inspiration from them. Releasing in 2014, Pirate's Curse did come out at the tail end of this craze, meaning it didn't have such a glut of competition, and it would have stood out regardless due to the series' pedigree and high quality graphical and sound presentation that a lot of other games couldn't match. What wasn't such great timing for Shantae was that it was released just 4 months after the most acclaimed of all the retro-style games from this period. Shovel Knight. The adventures of the eponymous warrior armed with shovels set a new standard for 2D action platformers. With its NES-era inspired visuals and sounds, accompanied by some highly addictive shovel pogoing gameplay, it was an instant success. Its shadow was still looming large when Shantae came out, but although I don't have any hard evidence to back up this claim, probably had an impact on people's interest level in Pirate's Curse and the game's sales. The biggest step forward for the series that Pirate's Curse made was in its plot and character development. The storyline itself is nothing groundbreaking. The Pirate Master, a tyrannical figure who was sealed away by the genies long ago, is attempting to revive himself, and so Shantae teams up with Risky Boots in order to thwart his resurrection. Meanwhile, Scuttletown has been taken over by the Ammo Baron, with the opening act of the game being Ammo Baron's invasion and destruction of the town, following on from a plotline started in Risky's Revenge where the mayor sells the town to the Baron. As I said, the plot itself isn't special, but more time is dedicated to telling the story this time around, not only with an increased number of cutscenes, but also in the presentation. As you progress through the islands, you can witness the rebuilding of Scuttletown occur, transforming into Ammo Town, with the traditional Islamic architectural style being replaced by a more mechanical, militaristic look. This change in Scuttletown's look not only gives the game a sense of time and progression, but also manages to effectively further a narrative without explicitly telling the player what's going on. You can see the Baron's workers rebuilding the town from the ruins, so the game doesn't need to waste time telling you through dialogue. Instead, the cutscenes are now spent developing the cast of midriff exposing characters, and do a far superior job than either of the previous 2 games. The most interesting of these is Rottytops, when at one point in the game you explore an area inhabited by the souls of the dead, wherein you encounter Rottytops' soul and assist her in regaining memories of her family and life. Giving side characters a little more depth like this goes a long way into making characters more memorable. I can't remember anything that Bolo did or said in the first game, and I only played it about 3 weeks prior to writing this, but his antics in Pirate's Curse won't be so soon forgotten. The whole tone of the story is as light-hearted and humorous as ever. The game is filled with jokes and liberally breaks the fourth wall for comedic effect. The Squid Baron is the best example of this. Aware of his own position in the game as a mid-level boss, his small arc sees him endeavour to become the greatest mid-boss he possibly can be, and is reminiscent of a certain other self-aware cephalopod. When it comes to the main narrative of the Pirate Master though, the game knows when it needs to present itself in a more serious light and turn down the comedic elements. As mentioned earlier, the final act that plays out is dependent on whether the player has found all 20 Cacklebats throughout the game. Taking the effort to do so is definitely worth it, as the true final boss and more hopeful ending that ensues serves as a far more satisfying conclusion to the game. I don't think I would be spoiling anything in saying that it's Risky who undergoes the greatest change by the narrative's end. As simplistic and light-hearted as the ongoing story of Shantae is, I appreciate that WayForward are consistently leaving small plot points deliberately unresolved, with them resurfacing later on. This tarriance of furthering lesser plot elements between titles allow for some minor but noticeable world building to occur across the series, in addition to forming a hook for players, leading to greater anticipation for the next game and seeing how these stories will develop. To conclude, Shantae and the Pirate's Curse is yet another success for the franchise, and despite some questionable design alterations, I would say it's the best game yet. The pirate tools on offer here provide a far greater variety of possible actions that the player can take, and work in perfect harmony with the accurate and responsive controls. There is a greater challenge to be had here, as well as some more engaging characters courtesy of additional time given to their development, and of course the always excellent soundtrack. The removal of a single, persistent world map to explore is disappointing, and the placement of some hidden collectibles could have been done with more care and attention, but these issues barely hamper the overall experience. Pirate's Curse also contains considerably more content, taking me nearly twice as long to complete as Risky's Revenge, but it never felt like it was dragging. Its campaign can still easily be conquered over the course of a single day, but this was once again a budget downloadable title, priced at $20 upon its release. It would also appear to be the most successful game in the series to this point. The 3DS eShop saw far greater use than a DSi equivalent, partly due to the fact that every 3DS console had access to it, and partly because the quality of titles available for it far exceeded the dregs of shovelware that plagued the DSiWare store. It also has double the number of reviews on Steam, which while not an exact metric, does indicate a substantial increase in ownership. While physical copies of this game are quite pricey due to the limited nature of their release, digital copies can be easily obtained on whatever your platform of choice may be, and it's definitely worth the purchase. In the next episode of this series, Shantae becomes the home console hero. I hope you'll join me again, and thank you for taking the time to watch this video.